welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, September 17th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the officiating that happened over this past weekend. It was all over the place. We had a number of calls that went just ways that I did not even think they could go, a number of calls that we need to get into, and then how do we kind of fix this? How do we get this to be in a better place than it is right now? Because right now it's just all over the place. Then we'll get into the winners and the losers from week 3. Definitely a lot I want to get into, including a couple around the UGA team. So I'll get into that in segment 2. Then we'll get into the week 3 whip around, do a couple of games that we just haven't gotten a chance to get to yesterday. Want to make sure I get them on y'all's radar. Then we'll get to questions of the week after week 3. Definitely a ton that I have to get to today, and we'll likely continue that into tomorrow before I get into my top 12 teams going into the week 4 slate. So we'll get that at the very end of the show. Definitely going to be a very interesting top 12, no doubt about that. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. Or you can use that super chat feature at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. Easy, you can just click on that $sign, add any question or comment you have, and then it'll pop up on the screen. We can have a fun back and forth here. Sometimes the chat moves a little bit quickly for me to keep track of, so definitely want to utilize that if you need to. But let's jump in right here, and let's talk about the officiating that happened this past weekend, because it was all over the place. There were about a million different examples I could go through of bad calls this past weekend, and I want to break down a couple right quick before we really jump into how we fix this, because the reality is something has to be done. There's too much energy in this sport. There's too many fans. There's too much money for this thing for this to be a problem. For the people wearing white and black to be as big a part of the game as the guys wearing shoulder pads. That should never be the case. I have no earthly idea why we've let it get this far, but here we are. So we got to figure out how we fix this, and I think the NCAA kind of has to do something. When we talk about when you talk about college football officiating in particular, it's all around different conferences, and it makes no sense. There's no reality where a a group of people that are calling the same rules are calling it under different circumstances, or being told to call it differently, because that's the reality. There are a number of examples of coaches. I believe Mike Gundy did this a couple of weeks ago in the Arkansas game, where he was just genuinely confused because there were certain things that crew was calling that a Big 12 crew normally doesn't call, and that's what he's used to. So it totally changes a game plan. You have to figure out a way to make this at least a group, at least a full-time group where all of these refs come from the same place, they are taught the same exact thing, and they have the same tendencies. Otherwise, you're going to have these type of results that are defined by the refs in a lot of different ways. And obviously, the best example from this past weekend was South Carolina. They had a number of calls go against them that were just downright terrible. The call on Kyle Kennard, I have no earthly idea how that was called. He was a runner at that point. He was a defender. You're supposed to block him. I understand that maybe he didn't need to block him. Doesn't matter. You're supposed to find the quarterback. You're supposed to block the quarterback when he throws a pick. That's just the reality. So I have no earthly idea how they called that and how that was called back, because that likely would have ended the game right about there. And then you had a couple others, Then you had a couple others. You had OPI that was absolutely inexplicable. I have no earthly idea what they were looking at on that play. And then Kyron Lacey on the other side had a catch that they called incomplete initially. He took like 4 steps in bounds before he went down out of bounds. It made no sense to me how that was ever called incomplete, and the fact that we had to take time away from the game to review a play that shouldn't have to be reviewed, it should just be a catch and we could keep it moving, is insane to me. And there was a number of others. I mean, Brian Kelly said he was sending something to the SEC office on the blocked punt, which I agree. I think that was a penalty. I think he jumped over the personal protector to block the punt, which is not allowed. Now, South Carolina fans don't care about that, and obviously LSU got the nicer part of the deal when it comes to the refs in this game, but the reality is they missed that one too. The refs in that game were just downright terrible, and it's no disrespect to the individuals, because the reality is the entire system is messed up. The entire system of the way that we go about business in officiating makes absolutely no sense. But a couple others. Triquez Bridges got kicked out of a game for targeting on this play. He got kicked out of a game for literally targeting Noah Thomas's butt. And I'm not kidding, his butt. He hit his butt with his head, and he was kicked out of the game for targeting. He wasn't even near his head. He wasn't near his shoulders. He wasn't even near his abdomen. He was near his butt, and he hit it with his helmet, and he got kicked out of the game. It was one of the most insane calls that I've ever seen in my life, and not what targeting is meant to do. Not what targeting is meant to do, even in the slightest, because I understand that Triquez Bridges hypothetically could have gotten hurt. He didn't. No one got hurt. No one was even close to getting hurt on that play. It is insane that was called. I don't understand how it was called. I was literally sitting there with my mouth open as that was getting called. I have no earthly idea how targeting has become something where if you drop your head, you can be hitting him in the toe and you get kicked out of the game. It doesn't make sense. It's not what football's about. And then you had a couple others. I mean, Jalen Walker, this isn't the play because I couldn't find a picture of the play, but he had a play where he makes a sack on Brock Vandegrift, gets penalized for roughing the passer because he was driving them into the ground. I don't understand this rule. 99% of the time, when people are trying to finish plays, they're going to drive someone into the ground. It is football. It is going to happen. These things are going to be a little bit dangerous. I understand trying to protect the players. I totally get that. But you're also putting the defenders at a wild disadvantage if Jalen Walker can't finish a play. If he can't finish a sack and his team very badly needs a sack, if he can't do that, then what are we doing? What game are we playing and what sport are we playing going forward? And then we had a number of others. Indiana had one against UCLA. Same exact thing. He's just finishing a tackle. He's just finishing a sack. I understand it definitely puts the quarterback at a little bit of danger. It also puts the defender at danger if they have to think about a million things as they're trying to tackle a guy. So I don't understand this rule. I've never understood it at the NFL or the college level, and I probably will never understand it. And then you had another one in the Oregon State game. Wish I could get a picture of this one because this was outright ridiculous. Oregon got flagged for roughing the passer, and the Oregon player hit the Oregon State quarterback's arm. He hit it as he was throwing the ball. How could that be roughing the passer? He literally was there as the ball was leaving his hands. I don't understand how we get to this point where all of these different things are called and we have no earthly idea how it's going to be called from one week to the next because you don't know what crew you have in front of you. So there's a number of ways to go about this, and this weekend was just kind of a large spotlight on it more than anything else because it's been happening for quite some time, but there have been a number of coaches that have spoken out about it. I mean, Kirby Smart this past weekend said, feels like everyone in the country is getting more penalties. It feels like everyone is getting a couple more per game, and we just have to figure out a way to stop it. But the reality is his team has been very, very good at avoiding penalties, at avoiding mistakes, and now they're getting penalized a ton. And I promise you, it didn't just happen overnight. It's not just Georgia's fault. And then you had guys like Pat Narduzzi who was talking out about it, about West Virginia, said he had to beat West Virginia and the refs, and I kind of agree with him. There were a number of calls in that game that were outright ridiculous. And then, obviously, you have Shane Beamer that's sending probably a novel to the SEC offices right about now, trying to figure out what happened in that game, why certain things were called, how they were called, and how he's supposed to move forward, getting his team prepared to play games with this kind of variable in play. And a couple of stats to kind of put this into perspective. South Carolina LSU had 52 total penalties they both have 52 total penalties this season, the most in the NCAA. 22 refs threw a flag in Williams-Brice Stadium. That's insane. There's no reality where a game should be defined that much by the people that are standing in white and black. That never should be the case. It should always be the guys wearing helmets, wearing shoulder pads that decide this game, and then the coaches. But the refs should just be a supplemental piece to this game. They should just be a way to keep all these kids safe, to make sure that the rules are enforced, and to make sure that there isn't anything going on that aggressively favors one team. They've not been doing a good job by any means. Also, another stat, South Dakota State leads the country with 39 penalties through 3 games. That is undisciplined. I'm not arguing that it's not. They have more penalties right now than Air Force and Minnesota had all of last season. I promise you, it's not just undisciplined football that's getting you there. It's refs calling these games a little closer than they need to and making this way more about the refs than it is about the game. And it's the most frustrating thing in the world, and I think we have to go back to just the organization of this entire thing. There are 10 major conferences in college football. Every single one has a different officiating system. Every single one employs different officiating crews, and every single one has different ways that they go about their business. It's not necessarily to say that they're enforcing different rules. They're not. But the Big 12 crews enforce it differently than the SEC crews. That's what Mike Gundy told us after the Arkansas game, was very confused how that went about. There is no reality where if you have the same rule book, you have the same set of rules, and they're written down the same way, that they should be enforced differently by different groups. And it's not the ref's fault necessarily, because they've been put in an impossible situation. They've been put in a situation where it's their fault on the field. It's not the people's fault who set up the structure where refs can kind of operate under different umbrellas. I don't understand why this isn't a national thing, why we don't have all-time refs, we don't have full-time refs that are employed by the NCAA that have to go about business a certain way and are going about business the same way pretty much across the board. There are going to be variables here and there. Obviously, these are humans. They're going to make not so great calls. They're going to make mistakes, all of that type of stuff. But it has to be closer than this. It can't be something that if, say, Texas is getting ready for a Big Ten game down the road, they're getting ready for the Michigan game and it's being called by a Big Ten crew. If that is something that has to factor into your game plan as you go into the game, we're doing something wrong. If you have to think about how the refs are going to call certain situations as you call plays, then something is going wrong. This is not about the refs, and it's not anything against the individual refs. It's against the system. We have to make this centralized. We have to make this a national thing where all the refs come from one organization, they're all taught one thing, and they go about their business in roughly the same way. It's not going to be perfect, but it has to be so much better than this. This is a very, very successful sport. This is a very successful sport with a lot of money, with a lot of people that have the ability to fix this, that have the ability to at least make this a little bit better. And right now, they're sitting on their hands for what I can kind of gather is just laziness. I don't understand why we can't get to a place where we fix this at least a little bit, just attempt to fix something within the world of officiating, because right now we're looking at this thing and no one has any earthly idea what the actual enforcement of these rules are. At least across the board, we have no standard. We have no reality of this is how it's going to be called, no matter who you're playing, no matter where you're playing, no matter what crew is taking care of it. So figure this out. I don't understand why this has taken so long. Make it a centralized body, and also figure out a centralized body for college football. That's a totally different conversation that is going to take time. I'm not arguing that, but the reality that a group of people that have so much power in our game are being, essentially just are in different groups around the country and are not following a certain set of the way you're going to go about business is outright insane. I don't understand why we haven't gotten to a point where officiating is a great part of the sport, but it's not the biggest part of the sport, and this weekend it was, and it should never be the case. So we'll take our first break here, but they got to figure this out as soon as possible, and if they don't, then they're going to start losing some fans because of it, because last weekend was just ridiculous. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to get into some winners and the losers from Week 3. Definitely a lot of people I want to get into, including Miami fans just having to have a great time over there in Coral Gables. But we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the officiating of this past weekend. It was really bad. There's no two ways to put it. It was very, very bad and something that just has to be fixed in the sport because it definitely can be, and for some reason we just haven't yet. But let's get into some winners and some losers from week 3. Hopefully we don't have to talk about officiating anymore on this show, but we'll see. Definitely something that could pop up throughout the season. But crazy week 3. A ton of things happened, a couple of upsets here and there from group of 5 teams, but overall the top teams kind of took care of business for the most part. So going to be an interesting group, but let's get into this. And the Miami fans have to be having the best year of their lives. They're walking into this season, they knew they had all this hype, they knew they had all this energy, but I think there was a part of them that was just a little bit wary. I think there was part of them that was sitting there saying, okay, feel really good about this season, feel really confident in this team, but we got to make sure we're ready to go. We got to make sure that everything comes into place, and I don't want to get too excited before they get on the field. Then they go up to Gainesville, Florida, absolutely body bag the Florida Gators, and they're going crazy, which is part of this as well. But you have a huge win to start your season, then you've taken care of business the last couple of weeks, and during that time, the two people that you recruit against the most, Florida and Florida State, have been burning. They've been all over the place. Florida obviously is going likely to have to undergo a coaching change here pretty soon. We'll see what happens on that. Obviously has not happened yet, but I expect it to happen here pretty soon. And then you have Florida State, isn't necessarily going through a coaching change, but is definitely going through some form of rebuild there. So Miami's just kind of hanging out. Miami's just kind of in a position where they can dominate recruiting in Florida for the vast majority of the next couple of years. They have the ability where if Florida doesn't get the next hire right, they're sitting pretty for quite some time. And on top of that, they're in a conference with Florida State where Florida State gets all the attention of being the, one suing the conference and being the one that's struggling after a great year and all this stuff. They're just hanging out and executing football and doing exactly what they wanted to do this upcoming season, but it came as well with a little bit of not so good fortune for their opponent. So they very much like what they're seeing on the football field from their team, but also absolutely love what they're seeing from Tallahassee and Gainesville right about now. But the loser was the SEC. The SEC's had a very interesting year thus far where A&M falls to Notre Dame at home, and then Notre Dame takes a terrible loss to NIU, or Texas beats Michigan at Michigan, and then Michigan looks benign the next week, and we'll talk about that game here in a second. But Vanderbilt is the team that this week really took the world by storm, losing to Georgia State, and then Mississippi State obviously getting torn apart by Toledo for much of that game. On top of that, you had terrible officiating around the conference in Columbia, South Carolina, as well as a number of other places, and then UGA kind of struggling, your top dog all over the place. So the SEC's just kind of had a weird year. They're kind of all over the place. You never really can't really get a beat on who's great, who's not. I mean, feel pretty good saying Texas and Ole Miss are great, but other than that, I think there's a lot of question marks in that conference, and there's a lot of teams that just aren't playing quite as crisp football as you would like right now. So the SEC is fine. There's plenty of teams that are playing really good football right about now, but as of right now, they're not necessarily quite as deep top to bottom as they usually are. Moving forward, the winners are the teams that actually found themselves, the teams that were able to figure out what was going on and figure out to get on the right path, and Oregon is the best example of this. They were explosive, they ran the ball for 240 yards, the O-line was a million times better, all of the stuff that we've talked about through the first couple of weeks. Oregon did exactly that on Saturday. It was absolutely incredible to watch, kind of unlocked what we thought Oregon was going to be this upcoming year, and likely will be reflected in my top 12 later. But the reality is, really impressive performance from this group. And then another was maybe A&M, maybe Notre Dame found a little bit of something in their identity of their offense that could possibly kickstart them into the next era of this season, get a really good thing rolling for both those teams. And then you had teams that moved in the opposite direction, like Georgia and a couple others, and those would definitely be losers. But Oregon absolutely found their stride this week, and I don't expect it to stop anytime soon. Losers were especially home SEC teams. They had a very, very tough week. There were 3 conference SEC games this past weekend. the away team won all of them. Georgia went into Kentucky and got a big-time win. LSU went to South Carolina, got a big-time win. And then A&M just rolled the Gators in the swamp. So a lot of things that were happening in the SEC that don't normally happen. Now, a lot of these, Kentucky especially, was taking them to the wire a little bit tougher, probably because they were at home and probably because that played a factor in the game, but not coming out on the winning side of that obviously does hurt quite a bit. I think A&M especially made this very, very known. That crowd was not a factor, and frankly, I do not blame them. I think at this point, when you see you're down 21-0 or 21-6, I can't exactly remember, at halftime to a backup quarterback, I don't know if I would throw my energy behind that team either. So I'm not necessarily going after Florida fans, but that's the reality. We had a number of different things that happened throughout this week, and Georgia and LSU came into Kentucky and South Carolina and kind of ruined a couple of rush the field scenarios in those, especially at South Carolina, which just don't go down to the field before the game is over. Just a general rule of thumb, just don't tempt fate that way. But at the end of the day, a very, very big day for a couple of away SEC teams. Some of them escaping some home atmospheres, no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, we're able to get some wins in some very tough atmospheres, including Florida and South Carolina. And then you have some winners. The group of five did really, really well. The group of five had a great weekend. It made things a little bit more complicated, no doubt about that, trying to figure out who the group of five team is going to be at the end of the day. But I do think it's a very interesting conversation. You had three of them that played Power 4 opponents and got wins, and they got paid to do it. So very, very nice time to be a group of five opponent. You had Toledo absolutely taking Mississippi State to the woodshed, probably the wildest thing I saw all weekend. And then you had Memphis going to Tallahassee and frankly not even play their best football and beat Florida State there. And then you had Georgia State get the finish of the weekend. You had UNLV went to Kansas, and got a win over the Jayhawks. So many different things that happened in the group of five that definitely make it more complicated to figure out who that last team is going to be at the end of the day. It's one of those that is going to be tough to figure out, but I think there's a number of really good candidates. I think you could go to Boise State if you really wanted to. That might be the best team, but probably haven't played the best football right about now. And then you have Memphis, you have UNLV, you have NIU, you have a million different teams that are absolutely going to have something to say about this, and I have no beat on it. I'll be totally honest with you. I don't know if Washington State and Oregon State are included in that, but if they are, maybe Washington State could be that group. I don't think they are if I am remembering correctly, but very, very interesting what's going on in the group of five, and frankly, I think it's going to be very tough to get a beat on the rest of the year. I'll be totally honest with you. The loser was most of us, I'll be totally honest with you. When we were watching this past weekend, there were a lot of really, really fun games. There were upsets, there were a couple of momentum turns, there were elite performances, there were new stars emerging like Arch Manning and all of these people, but the reality is, when you're watching these games, it was really hard to not be mad at the officiating. It was really hard to sit there and say, I'm really enjoying this game, I absolutely love everything that's going on, without also saying, but the refs are getting a little bit too much involved. The LSU South Carolina game was one of the best games of the year, probably the best game of the year up until this point. The refs were a big part of that, and that's not something that you ever want to happen. It's never something that you really want to get involved in, is this game is being decided by the guys that are the zebras, essentially, that are deciding this game. So you got to be able to figure out a way to fix this. We talked about it in the last segment, so I won't waste too much more time here, but I have to imagine this was a shared feeling. I have to imagine everyone was watching in. Some benefit more than others, so maybe some aren't necessarily yelling quite as loud, but I do think it was kind of a bad Saturday in terms of officiating. It's always a good Saturday when college football is on, but the reality is it felt like every game that I was watching, there were a couple of calls that made me scratch my head and made me just a little bit angry, and I never want to be that way on college football Saturday. So it was a bad day for officiating, no two ways about it. Hopefully we get a little bit better this upcoming weekend, and it's not quite as frustrating, but we'll see what happens, and hopefully we're on the winner side of this next weekend. Winners is anyone with UGA on their schedule. This UGA team finally showed weakness. They showed a little bit of an opening that you possibly can exploit. This O-line is not on the level that it needs to be. If they're going to go into Tuscaloosa with that O-line in 2 weeks, they're going to lose. I can absolutely promise you that. If they're going to go to Austin in a couple of weeks with that O-line, they're going to lose. Now, the good news is they have 14 days to figure out all of the different things they have to fix and get that O-line in the better place. So it's not necessarily all that bad of a thing, but the O-line was not all that great on Saturday. The run game was bad right now. The offensive play calling was all over the place. it just really wasn't UGA football. They've had a number of different games throughout the last couple of years that have looked clunky, that have looked a little bit all over the place, but they always seem to look better than this. This Saturday looked a little bit different than the other ones, but at the end of the day, I think when you can see someone like that, when you can see a little crack in the armor, it makes you feel a little bit more confident. It doesn't necessarily mean you have a better shot of beating them, but it does mean when they walk into your stadium, you at least believe that you can beat them, and that means the world. But the other part of this is they know this, and they also know what's possible when this team gets that type of energy, and they know the other part of all of this, which means, yes, teams with UGA on their schedule are losers in this weekend because Kirby Smart got exactly what he needed. They did not want to be number 1 in the AP poll, I can promise you that. They very badly wanted to be number 2 or number 3 so they could definitely flex their muscles just a little bit and definitely use that as bait because Kirby Smart is one of the best motivators in the sport. That does not need to be said. Everyone understands that. He just needs a little bit of food. He just needs a little bit of bait to get his boys going, to get his boys running, and then it's going to be a problem. So we gave it to them. They officially have it. That bad Kentucky performance gave them a little bit of an opening. Texas is now on top of them in the rankings, and Kirby gets to use that for the next 13 days. And then we'll see what happens in Tuscaloosa. But the reality is I'm having a hard time saying this UGA team is just outright bad now, or this UGA team is attackable, or they're going to lose to Alabama. I'm more on the other side. I think I'm more on the losers than the winners. I will say, seeing them struggle the way they did gives you a lot more confidence going into that one. But on the other side of that, you have a coach and a team in general that is going to thrive off this, that is going to take this and probably shove it down a lot of people's throat throughout the year. But we'll see what happens on this one. Obviously, a ton of winners and losers from this past weekend, and I think the people that have UGA on their schedule somehow fit into both groups. I think you feel a little bit more confidence because you saw the guy get a little bit of crack in his armor, but you also know what's on the other side of that, which is Kirby Smart just reaming these guys out for the next 13 days and likely being really ready to go in Tuscaloosa. But let's take our second break here. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the other games that we didn't have a chance to get to yesterday. Just a couple of games, some blowouts, some not, that definitely want to get on y'all's radar because there were some really interesting things that happened in them. But we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the winners and the losers from this past weekend. Somehow everyone that has UGA on their schedule is in both groups. They have to feel a little bit more confident about what they saw this past Saturday in beating Georgia, but they also know the motivation and the bulletin board material is flowing in Austin in Athens right about now. So we'll see what happens with that. Definitely something to watch. But let's get into a little bit of a week 3 whip around. There are a couple of games that I want to get on y'all's radar that we didn't have a chance to get to yesterday. A couple of top teams that really handled business, but want to get into how they handle business, especially one of these teams here in a second. But let's start with Ole Miss, because this is a conversation that we've had pretty much every single week throughout this season with Ole Miss, thus far at least, where they play a really good game, they play really clean, they execute at a really high level, and then at the end of the game, it's all about, well, it's just Wake Forest, well, it's just Middle Tennessee, I believe is who they played last week, well, it's just blah, 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 it's just X, it's just Y. The reality is executing at this high of a level is a big deal. The reality is when you can walk into a place like Wake Forest, I know that's not the greatest team in the world. I know they aren't going to compete for the ACC or anything crazy. But being able to make that not a doubt, being able to walk in there and say, we are going to fully take care of business, we're never going to leave this up to chance, and we're never going to let this crowd get involved is a big deal. It's what championship teams do. It's what elite teams do, and we'll see what happens Texas has done it throughout this year. I think Missouri's done a good job of it, although this past weekend was a little bit tougher against a good opponent. Ole Miss has done it. Tennessee has done it. There have been a number of teams that have just executed at a really high level. Maybe they don't have the biggest win in the world. Ole Miss probably the main among these groups, but maybe they don't have the biggest win in the world. They're executing at a ridiculously high level right now. So I'm having a hard time knocking them for winning games. But then you have Georgia Southern this weekend, then you have Kentucky, and then on the October 5th and 12th, you have South Carolina, and then you have at LSU. Got to make sure you get those two. If you get those two, then you're off running and likely one of those teams that is looking at the SEC title as a very, very real possibility. And then you had Notre Dame take Purdue to the woodshed in this game. And now I would be very, very happy about this Notre Dame win. I would feel very good about what Notre Dame is going forward. Thing is, they didn't really change much. They just did better at what they usually do, which is run the ball. They ran the ball for 364 yards on the ground, held Purdue to 38 yards rushing, just total domination from this team. I'm still a little bit worried about this team going forward. I'm still worried about their ability to make something happen in the pass game, at least enough to win those big-time games, but a huge bounce-back performance nonetheless, and something that I think Notre Dame fans badly needed to see. So at least they're back on the right track. We'll see what happens from here, but as of right now, I think I'm pretty much where I was a couple of weeks ago with Notre Dame. And then you have Tennessee just do mean stuff to Kent State. They were up 30 in the first quarter and then did an onside kick. I don't know why. It was kind of mean. It's just ridiculous. But at the end of the day, Tennessee gets a big-time win, is still executing at a ridiculously high level. Kent State gets Penn State next, and it's just mean. I think it's going to be really, really tough what's going to happen to them this year. There's a possibility where they go 0-12. I'll be totally honest with you. But Tennessee keeps it rolling. They keep doing what they're supposed to do. A little bit of showboating at some points throughout this game, but can't necessarily get too mad at that. Then you had Miami take care of business against Ball State. I think this is what it's about, right? It's about handling business, moving on to USF, and making sure you're ready for that game. Cam Ward continued to be Cam Ward. 19 for 28, 346, 5 touchdowns. Was absolutely incredible, and now he gets into the thick of the season. You get into USF this upcoming weekend, then you got the ACC coming up. So a lot more ahead of Miami, a lot more than they probably need to just continue to play at this level. Frankly, this is probably good enough to win the ACC, but I do think it's going to be interesting to watch this team go through the ACC with Cam Ward as their quarterback for the first time in the ACC. It'll be fascinating to see how they kind of develop throughout the season, but everything's rolling right now for the Hurricanes. And then you had Oklahoma State just dominate Tulsa in a game that I didn't necessarily think Oklahoma State was going to be in danger of losing, but I thought Tulsa was going to hang around for just a little bit more. And the most impressive thing about this whole thing is Ollie Gordon has not been himself this year. Ollie Gordon has not been the guy that has won them football games this year. The last two games, he's had 17 carries apiece. He's gone for 49 and 41 rushing yards. Now, he did have a touchdown in the 49 rushing yards, I guess, against South Dakota State. But the reality is, or not against South Dakota State, against whoever they played in week 2. I'm blanking right now. But the reality is Alan Bowman is stepping up, which is absolutely huge. We talked about it going into the season that I was a little bit worried about their ability to keep Ollie Gordon going and then get what they needed from Alan Bowman. He went 24 of 31, 396, 5 touchdowns and a pick on Saturday, and he has a huge chance this weekend against Utah to prove that once again. So we'll see what happens there. Definitely going to be really fun to watch him develop throughout the season, but playing really good football right about now in Stillwater. And then you had Utah, the team that is coming in this weekend. Are they this weekend or next weekend? I'll have to check that. But one of these weekends, they are coming in to play you, and it's going to be really fun to watch. Now, Cam Rising did not play in this game. Definitely going to be something to watch going into next week, and hopefully he's back because, frankly, I think they need him. They were down 14-3 in this game, scored 25 straight points, went on to outscore them 35-7 in the final, 2 and some change quarters of this game. But the reality is they started slow on offense, and they cannot do that against Oklahoma State. They can't do that against a ton of different Big 12 teams. So badly need Cam Rising back. It was great to see Isaac Wilson play, and he seemed very, very confident, seems to be throwing the ball around, and I think gave Utah fans plenty to be excited about for the future. But as of right now, you're going to need Cam Rising to win those big-time games, including that one in Stillwater here pretty soon. And then you got Arkansas State, Michigan, and this one was gross, I'll be honest. Michigan came off a game where they played really, really bad offensive football, and they pretty much did it again on Saturday. Now, they were a little bit cleaner, especially running the ball. They were very effective with Khalil Mullings over 100 yards. I think Donovan Edwards right around there. But the reality is they had 3 picks from Davis Warren. Actually, none of the passes from Davis Warren touched the ground. He went 11 for 14 with 3 picks. So, very weird stat line. But at the end of the day, they are making a quarterback change up there at Michigan. It is going to be Alex Orji this upcoming weekend against USC. I believe we'll break that game down tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, maybe on Thursday, but going to be a really, really fun game. And I think at the very least, Alex Orji gives them an identity. At the very least, you know what you're getting every single down. You know that you're going to be a run-first team that picks its points in the passing game. So at least it gives Kurt Campbell a jumping off point, because right now they have no identity and have very little idea of what they want to do. So I do think getting at least an idea of who you are, an idea of what this team is going to be under Alex Orji is going to be a big deal. I don't necessarily think it's going to elevate this team a ton, but at the very least, it'll make this offense run a little bit smoother than it has been in the past. And then you got UAB Arkansas. Arkansas has a problem. They play down to competition. They play up to competition like no one else I've ever seen. And it's a coaching problem more than anything else. This is a coach in Sam Pittman that definitely has some questions to answer. I do think there is going to be a lot of fans that are asking probably for his job at the end of the year, depending on how the rest of the year goes, of course. But as of right now, they have very little pass game. Kalen Green went for 161 and a pick in this game. They just really weren't able to get anything going. Now, the run game was plenty fine, and they were able to obviously get the win, but this was an ugly one from Arkansas. They got to figure some things out. Winning only by 10 points against UAB is not a reality they should be living in, but it is right now. So we'll see what happens with them the rest of the season, see what happens with Sam Pittman the rest of the season, but this one was bad. No two ways about that. And then you had Duke get a win over UConn 26-21, another team that is just doing just enough to win games. Duke is not playing all that clean of football right now, but they're doing enough, I suppose. They beat Northwestern in a really gross one, I believe, last weekend on a Thursday, and then beat UConn this upcoming weekend. They outscored them 10-0 in the fourth, so made the plays they very much needed to in the fourth quarter, but as of right now, they got a lot to figure out for Duke. Malik Murphy was doing what he needed to do, made a number of plays throughout this game, went 28 for 43, 267, 3 touchdowns and a pick. So wasn't necessarily perfect, but did enough. No two ways about that. And we'll see what this Duke team is going into the ACC play. But as of right now, I do not have a lot of confidence in them to be able to score much of anything against these ACC teams. But another ACC team that did not play well this weekend and hasn't played well pretty much the entire year is NC State. They won 30-20 over Louisiana Tech, and this NC State team is just all over the place. There's not a real discernible identity on offense. There's not a rhythm by any means. It sounds like Grayson McCall likely will not be the quarterback going forward. It sounds like it will be CJ Bailey going forward, and I think it's one of those things that neither quarterback has really played all that well, but CJ Bailey opens the quarterback run game just a little bit more, and that's kind of what matters at this point for NC State. You just have to throw as much stuff at these defenses as possible, and that's going to be the best way to go about business. So I don't know if it makes them all that better moving from Grayson McCall to CJ Bailey, but I know it gives the defense at least one more player to worry about in the run game. So at the very least, that matters a little bit, and we'll see what happens. Maybe Grayson McCall gets the job back, but right now, the way this offense has been moving, I wouldn't necessarily object to a little bit of a change at quarterback. And then you got App State get a big-time win, going to East Carolina and getting a 21-19 win. And this was a under-the-radar game, but very, very fun. They did not get anything going on the ground if you were App State. They had so much trouble running the ball, only 2.3 yards per carry. But Joey Aguilar had his Jekyll and Hyde performance that he tends to have pretty much every week. Went for 424, 2 touchdowns, but also 2 interceptions. He was Joey Aguilar in a number of different ways. But ECU took a quick 16-0 lead after a pick six from Siobhan Revel Jr., very, very talented player. And then you had a number of different things. But the rest of the game was really controlled by App State. They responded right after that, cut the deficit to 16-14 going into halftime, and then just kind of tore them to pieces the rest of the way. They were very, very impressive in this game, at least in the back part of this game, and were able to handle business and keep things rolling. I have some big-time questions about this App State team, especially on the defensive side of the ball, but the point is to keep that Sun Belt trophy alive, keep that title hopes alive, and as of right now, they very much are. So we'll see what happens with this team as going forward. I don't feel great about them necessarily, but definitely a team that will have plenty to say in the Sun Belt, no doubt about that. And then I wanted to touch on Auburn real quickly because Hank Brown made the start for this team over Peyton Thorne. Very, very interesting decision. One that I don't necessarily object with too much. I understand you need a little bit of a spark on offense, and Hank Brown went to work in this game. Went 17 for 25, 235, 4 touchdowns. Obviously, it is New Mexico, so take it for what you will, but it will be awesome to watch this guy play the rest of the year. I think he's a very talented young player. I think Walker White right behind him is another very talented young player. So it's going to be fun to see how the quarterback position is handled by Auburn. Obviously, he's going to be a huge thing going forward, and they'll have to figure it out. And then the other part of this was Jarquez Hunter lives. He is alive. He went 20 carries, 152 yards, a touchdown in this game, so they badly need him going forward. He is the best player on the field for them, and they need him to be a huge part of the game. They have Arkansas this week before OU comes to town. If they can get 2 wins there, then Auburn's back rolling, and we'll see what happens from there. But a really crazy weekend, a number of games that I just wanted to get on y'all's radar. Ole Miss taking care of business, a lot of top teams taking care of business in a number of ways this last weekend. But let's take our third break here. When we come back, we're going to do some questions from this past weekend, like where do Florida State and Florida go from here? And the answer is not too easy to get you, but we'll give it that right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little bit of a week 3 whip around, got to all of the games that didn't necessarily have a chance to get to this yesterday, so wanted to make sure I got those on y'all's radar. But let's get into some questions around week 3 because there are a lot coming out of that weekend because it was a wild weekend with a number of different things happening. But I feel like you have to start with what do Florida State and Florida do going forward? What is the next course of action? And for one of these, it's a little bit easier than the other, and that's the weird thing about this. But overall, the short answer is, I don't know. I think there's a number of things that have to be fixed at both programs, and I think you got a long list to start checking things off. But for Billy Napier, he's likely done. I think we all understand that. Nothing is obviously concrete. Nothing is in stone right now, but I do expect it to happen pretty soon. And then you got to figure out who you're going to hire next, and you got to nail that hire. There's been a lot of talk around Lane Kiffin. I know Ole Miss fans hate that, and they think Ole Miss is a better job. I can almost promise you that Lane Kiffin would leave, but I haven't talked to Lane, so who knows? Maybe he would stick around, but as of right now, it would be really interesting to see where they would go next. I think there's a lot up in the air for Florida. I think there's a lot of things in that program that do work, but I do think the head coach needs to change, and we'll see what happens from there forward, but that's the easy answer. You change the head coach, and then you let the chips fall where they may. You make sure you make a good hire, but you see what happens from there, and then the Florida State case is a little bit more complicated. When you talk about this team in Florida State, they have to figure out a path forward, but the reality is that's your head guy. Mike Norvell is likely your guy through this year into 2025, unless they go 1-11 or something absolutely terrible. I expect him to be the coach going forward. The thing is, a lot of things need to change behind the scenes. I think they need to change the way they go about building a roster. It's way too much into the portal and not enough high school recruiting, and you're not playing all that great of football right now, so high school recruiting is not going to be all that easy. And then you have a number of other things that need to change within this program, whether it's scheme-based or different things that just have to be cleaned up. But overall, you got to fix this roster construction. There can't be a reality where you expect to compete every single year if you're bringing in 25, 30 guys that have to compete. that have to be able to produce for you if you're going to be successful, and that was the reality for Florida State this year. So it's kind of funny. Both these teams are in very interesting spots, are kind of in the same but very different spots all at the same time. Both could find their way back to the top very soon. I think Florida State obviously has their guy going forward, and I think he's a really good head coach. I just think a couple of the screws need to be tightened, if you will, around there in Tallahassee. And then for Florida, it's almost a more simple situation. It's almost a little bit easier to handle because you just got to get rid of the guy, bring in a new guy, and then see what happens. For Florida State, you got to kind of change who the guy is in some respects. So it's going to be really interesting to watch that develop. But overall, I don't really know. I think there's a huge question around how these two programs are going to handle what's coming for them. And it's going to be two very different ways to go about business, but hopefully both of them are successful because then fans are going to get very restless if you're not. But it'll be interesting to watch that. But let's move on to who had the biggest win of the weekend. This is kind of a fun conversation because it's not necessarily about who had the highest ranked win because that would be Kansas State, or who outkicked their coverage the most because that would likely be Toledo. But there are a number of different teams that I have in mind here. I think Bama has a really, really good argument here, not because I think Wisconsin is world beaters by any means, but because I think Alabama just went about their business in such a way that was really confident, really efficient, did exactly what you would expect them to do, and looked like an Alabama team. And that was really, really impressive to watch them. And then you have Missouri making that comeback win over Boston College. For me, more than anyone, it's LSU. And this is obviously with a little bit of help from the officials. We talked about it earlier in the show, but the reality is LSU's path to victory this upcoming this season is just stay in the fight. Give yourself a shot as many times as you can throughout the season to be in a playoff position where when Ole Miss comes to town in a couple of weeks, or I believe October 12th, that crazy weekend that we're going to have in a little bit, but once they come to town that weekend, make sure you're still in the fight. Make sure that you only have one loss on your record right at that point, and then you can make some things happen. But overall, this is a team that absolutely needed this win, and they were able to get it done. They were down 17. They were able to come back with a little bit of help from South Carolina, a little bit of help from the refs, but made some plays that they needed to make. And the end-all be-all is LSU is still in the conversation, and that's what they need to be for as long as they can be. It will be very tough, but on a week-to-week basis, just make sure that you can come out on top. And then that Ole Miss game, see where the chips fall, and then maybe you're right in the thick of things rather than kind of just trying to tread water. But a huge win for LSU, one that if they didn't get it, we would be talking very differently about this program and about Brian Kelly right about now. And then on top of that, you have Memphis, UNLV, and many more that boosted their CFP odds. So a lot of impressive performances, a lot of great wins, but I would lean LSU got the biggest win of this past weekend. And then how long can Texas be okay without Quinn Ewers? This has been a conversation that has been going on around social media for quite some time, or for the last couple of days, and I've already become a little bit exhausted by it. I won't lie to you, but I want to make this just very clear from the outset. There is no quarterback controversy at Texas. Quinn Ewers is quarterback one. Arch Manning is the quarterback until Quinn Ewers is healthy. That is the reality. That is the end-all be-all. There is very little that Arch Manning could do over the next 2 weeks to be able to take that job. And frankly, I tend to believe that's what's going to happen. I think Arch Manning is likely going to start this upcoming weekend against ULM, and then you will likely see Quinn Ewers back for that Mississippi State game. Now, there is a reality where they keep him out until that bye week to get him ready for that Oklahoma game, and I tend to believe they would be fine against Mississippi State with Arch Manning at quarterback, but they need Quinn Ewers to be the guy. They need Quinn Ewers. If they're going to compete for a national title, that needs to be their quarterback. And it's not necessarily that Arch Manning is bad or he is a massive step off. The offense runs just so much more efficiently when Quinn Ewers is in there. The bag of what Steve Sarkisian can call is so much deeper. There are a million different reasons why this is Quinn Ewers' team and not Arch Manning's. I understand the running ability is really awesome. I understand he can throw the ball downfield really well, and he's an awesome quarterback. There's no two ways about that. I think I would argue they have two starting quarterbacks in Texas right now, but the reality is this is Quinn Ewers' team. Once he is healthy, he will be back as the starting quarterback. I tend to believe it'll be against Mississippi State, but maybe you see him against OU in a couple of weeks, depending on how Arch does this upcoming weekend. But definitely will be interesting to watch. I don't think there's any chance that Arch Manning is the quarterback going forward after Quinn Ewers is healthy, but it's one of those things that will definitely be interesting to watch how long it takes Quinn Ewers to get back. Doesn't sound like it's too serious right now, but the longer it takes, the more nervous some Texas fans get out there. And then you have who are the top Heisman candidates coming out of this weekend. Frankly, it starts with the guy that it started with in week one, and that's Cam Ward. He's just been playing elite football since that day, and I think it's very hard to argue really anyone else at number one. Now, I do have another player that deserves a little bit more respect than he's getting right now, but the reality is very impressive performances from him thus far. He is my Heisman frontrunner as of right now. I think if Quinn Ewers was healthy throughout that game, he likely would still be up there, but Cam Ward right now is my number one. And then I feel like we got to talk about Jalen Milroe. Had 5 touchdowns this past weekend, did a ton with his legs, did much more with his arm than I think a lot of people expected, but was really, really impressive this past weekend and definitely shot himself into that conversation. No two ways about that. And then you have guys that are playing really clean football. Jackson Dart, I think Quinn Ewers is still in this conversation. Once he comes back healthy, we'll see what happens. But you have Jackson Dart, you have Nico Iamaleava doing incredible things. My top 3, I think, would go Cam Ward 1, Ashton Jainty 2, because I'm not disrespecting a guy that was just had a bye week this past weekend. That's the only thing that has stopped Ashton Jainty thus far. And then you have Jalen Milroe at 3. I do think this performance this past weekend was absolutely huge. I could put Jackson Dart there. I could kind of flip that around if I wanted to, but I do think Jalen Milroe has done plenty to be in this conversation, and we'll see what happens from here. Obviously, it gets a lot tougher for him going forward, but definitely a huge performance this weekend, and in my opinion, has slotted himself very much in that Heisman conversation. Who missed an opportunity, who missed the biggest opportunity this past weekend is a huge question because it's a big debate. There are a lot of teams that missed big-time opportunities this past weekend where you talk about Kentucky. You had a team, the number one team in the country, on the ropes at home and could not capitalize. I think punting the ball away when you were up 1 is absolutely insane, but at the end of the day, I'm not the head coach. But I think this was one of those chances to entirely change the psyche of this team. You're coming off a game where you just got absolutely torn to pieces by South Carolina. You're probably feeling very down on yourself, not feeling like this team has a lot of confidence. Beating Georgia would have gotten all of that back and then some. You would have felt great about the rest of the schedule. You would have been talking yourself into them making a run. All this different stuff that really does matter when those guys walk out on that field. So a huge opportunity missed there by Kentucky, but the number one team is South Carolina. There's no two ways about that. And some of this is not their fault. I will say that out front, but the reality is you had LSU in town, a team that you hate and a lot of people hate around you, and then you had game day there. You were up 17. It was terrible. It was one of those games that you felt like if South Carolina was able to win it, they're 3-0, they got an SEC win against LSU, and they're looking at the rest of their season as anything can happen, as a possibility of literally anything being on the table. And we'll see what happens with Lenore Sellers moving forward, and we'll see just how bad this could become for South Carolina. And they have a really tough schedule, so it's not necessarily to say if they won this past weekend they'd be off running and would be a CFP team, but it is to say this would have built a ton of confidence on top of already a ton of confidence around Columbia, South Carolina. So I think that was a huge missed opportunity for them. Boston College missed an opportunity, obviously, this past weekend, being up 14 and then just giving up 24 straight points. Never going to be a winning formula. Wisconsin, at the end of the day, you missed an opportunity, but you never really had a shot at the opportunity, to be totally honest. So I'm not necessarily including that one, but overall, I think South Carolina missed an opportunity to possibly become the darling of college football, to become the Cinderella of the season and really make a lot of people kind of become fans overnight. But going to be interesting to watch that this next week. I think South Carolina's got to respond. They have a relatively easy game, but we'll see what happens in that one. And then I want to talk about Washington State. Could Washington State be the kind of wrench that's thrown into the college football playoff? Because this is a really good team. They're playing really good football right now, and they're playing football to a level that I look at the rest of their schedule, I don't know if there's a concrete loss. They go to Boise State, they go to Fresno State. Those are the issue areas. If you can win those, this could be an undefeated team. And I know that sounds crazy because coming into the season, they were kind of an afterthought in a lot of these conversations around the playoff, but they're playing really good football. Now, the one variable here that has to be talked about is John Mateer. If he is not on the field, if he goes down with an injury, and obviously very much hoping he doesn't, but he does use his legs a lot. He does put himself in that dangerous area a lot. It could happen at some point this season. They need him on the field. If he's off the field for even one game, there's a reality where they lose their chances. And the other part of this is they cannot lose. Another reason why he has to be on the field every single game, because an 11-1 Wazoo team is not getting in. I'm just being totally honest. They'll find a million different reasons to not let them in, but they would not get in. So it's going to be a little bit of a tightrope walk. They're going to have to get a little bit of a health luck throughout this season, but this is a very dangerous team, and one that is making every type of case you would possibly need to possibly make the playoff as a Pac-12 team right now. But an incredible thing from them, and I think overall there's a ton of questions. I'll probably have a couple more tomorrow for you, but overall I think this is a crazy week 3. We'll see what happens in week 4, and there's a ton of questions around, especially those 2 programs in Florida, and we'll see what happens with them probably pretty soon in Gainesville if I had to imagine. But let's take our last break here, and when we come back, we're going to do my Top 12 Tuesday. Not too much movement here, but definitely enough to give you guys a little bit of an update. So we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different questions coming out of week 3, and we'll likely continue that going into tomorrow because I have a number that I did not get to today. But let's get into my top 12 because this was a weird week. Definitely, there were a lot of movement around the top teams. Now, there weren't a lot of teams that necessarily lost around the top group, but there was definitely a little bit of movement, and I want to get into that right here. So it's going to be a very interesting list. I think there's a number of teams that have bopped up and down. I think there's a number of teams that could be, 3 places above or 3 places below. That is how close a lot of these teams are right now, at least in my mind. But for me, it starts with Kansas State. And this is a very, very hard position to fill, likely the hardest in the entire list because I don't know if there's a number 12 team in the country right now. I know that sounds crazy, but I don't know if there's 12 teams that have really played all that great of football throughout the first 3 weeks, but I was really impressed with what I saw from Kansas State this past weekend. I thought they did a really good job of utilizing Avery Johnson's legs, and I thought he was the guy that really changed that offense. When you talk about that offense, it all starts with the run game, and if you can get that guy involved, then they get a lot more dangerous in a hurry. I love this team, and I think I was just waiting for them to really confirm what I thought I knew about this team, and felt like they did that on Friday. So really impressive team, and I would have them as number 12 right about now. Although I think Utah and them are really fighting over this position, honestly. And then you have Missouri at 11. I think Missouri got a great win this past weekend, no doubt about it, but didn't necessarily change too much about what I think about this team. I still have my little bit of worries on the defensive side of the ball. There will be plenty of chances for them to come up, them to climb up these rankings, no doubt about it. But as of right now, I think 11 is roughly where they're supposed to be. I think this is a really good team, and they have a number of different chances where they go to College Station in a couple of weeks, where if they win that one, then they're likely off to the races. Right now, I'm just a little bit skeptical of this Missouri team. Maybe it's just me being a little bit untrusting of this team, but overall, I think it's going to be interesting to watch them develop. I just wouldn't have them above any of the teams I'm about to talk about. Penn State is my number 10 team. They were on a bye this past weekend, so kind of just hung out. Didn't necessarily do anything wrong. There was one team that did jump them because of how they played, but that was beside the point. I think there's a number of different things that are going to happen with Penn State going forward. Coming off a Bowling Green game where it did not play very well, was all over the place. I don't think that will continue, but they have Kent State at home this weekend. Then they have Illinois coming to town, which will be a very interesting game. We'll see what happens. Illinois actually has a ranked matchup this weekend, so we'll break that one down likely tomorrow, but there's going to be a ton of big-time games. But you got to really get rolling before that October 12th matchup against USC. If you can be ready to roll once you go into LA, then it's going to be a really, really fun game. And that's my number 9 team. The USC Trojans have played really clean football. They were also on a bye this past weekend, but they now have a big-time Michigan game on the way. And if they win that one, then I'm probably moving them a little bit further up, although we don't really know what Michigan is right about now. But I think this is a really impressive team. Obviously, the defense is the biggest thing. When we were coming into this season, I talked about this probably a million times, and I had said anything above, number 70, number 75 in the country in total defense would have been great for this team. After I believe being 110, 116 a year ago, they're going to be better than that. They have done an incredible job early on in the season. And obviously, it's about to get a lot tougher with Michigan and a lot of these teams coming up, but they're a really impressive team. And they've flipped that defense in a lot of ways that I didn't even think was possible. Really impressed with what they've been able to do, and obviously very much apologize for USC fans for doubting this for a second, because DeAnton Lynn has come in and totally flipped that thing on its head. And then I have Oregon at 8. I think this was a team that I dropped a little bit throughout the last couple of weeks because they just hadn't shown me who they were. They hadn't shown me what at least I thought they were. This weekend they did, and I felt like I had to bump them up a little bit. Didn't want to go too far because I still have my worries. I think it's possible that they get into the Big Ten play and don't play quite as clean football as you'd like. So we'll see what happens. They definitely could keep climbing up this list, but just wanted to see this. I just wanted to see that this is the Oregon team that we're getting, and I tend to believe that's what we're going to get going forward. Very, very impressive performance this past weekend, and likely is the kickstart to a very good season up there in Eugene. And then I have Bama at 7. This was very, very tough. These next 4 or 5 teams really is very tough to order because Alabama played a really good game of football this past weekend. There's no two ways about that. I just don't know if they did enough to jump some of these other teams on this list. So it's honestly nothing really against Alabama. It's just between like 7 and 4, it's incredibly tough to order these guys. But really impressive stuff. I think Jalen Milroe is one of those guys that you're not necessarily going to get too much more out of him. I think he's likely who he is. He's going to be able to run the ball, throw a really nice deep ball, but those NFL level throws are going to be a little bit tough to come by. Now, if you can run it as efficiently as they did on Saturday, not going to be a problem. You're going to be able to execute plenty fine regardless. But really, really impressed with this team overall, but really impressed with this defense. I think Kane Womack coming in and being able to create a defense that is downright scary after Nick Saban walked out the door is really, really impressive. Number 6, I do have Tennessee. Another team that could go anywhere from 4 to 7 if you really wanted them to. But they've been playing really clean football, look like a well-oiled machine right now, both on offense and defense, which I'm still a little bit worried about that defense, but they're answering just about every question I have on a week-to-week basis. So really, really impressive stuff. They have dudes all over the place. Josh Heupel has done just an incredible job building out this team, obviously with offensive talent first, but then really putting a lot of energy into defense and making this one of the deepest defensive lines in particular in the entire country. Really impressive group. They have dudes all over the place. Josh Heupel is as confident as he's ever been, and he's definitely showing it on the field. There's no two ways about that. So this is a scary team that could continue to fly up these rankings, especially if they blow out Oklahoma this upcoming weekend. Then we're having a very interesting conversation around Tennessee. And then you have Miami at 5. I just didn't want to move them down too far. I think I could have moved Tennessee above them, but didn't necessarily feel enough to do that. I think it's very, very, very close, as I've said, but this is going to be one that's really, really fun to watch. I think this is a team that is playing as elite of football as anyone in the country. Cam Ward is so confident. He brings that entire team confidence that they very much need throughout the season, and it's just as clean as you could possibly want. And the more you look down the road, the more it looks like it's Miami and everyone else in the ACC. Obviously, Clemson will have something to say about that, but right now this team looks like they're on another planet than a lot of ACC teams, and it'll be fun to watch this team going forward. Very impressive thus far. I think I could put them at 7. I think I could put them at 6, but I'm going to keep them at 5 for right now, and we'll see what happens in the coming weeks. But Ole Miss I have at number 4. This team is playing such clean football. They're doing everything that you could possibly want them to do, and I understand that the competition isn't all that great. If you watch this team for a second, you understand that this is one of the best teams in the country. They are playing so clean. Everything is so crisp. Everything exactly the way you want it to be in. It's because Jackson Dart is in control. He is fully in control of this offense. He's utilizing his legs when he needs to, and is a very gritty player. Is so much fun to watch. One of those guys that you just couldn't wait to see him in full control of an offense, and this is what it looks like. It's downright terrifying. So really impressive stuff from Ole Miss thus far. I have them as my number 4 team in the country again, number 4 through 7. So Ole Miss, Miami, Tennessee, Alabama. Rank them however you want. I'm more than fine with pretty much whatever you put in front of me with those 4 teams, but I do think Ole Miss, at least in my opinion, has been the most impressive thus far, at least if I'm including what I thought going into the season as well, which is part of this. But number 3, I do have Georgia. I felt like they had to drop just a little bit, and I'm not down on Georgia. I want that to be very, very clear because I am not worried about what I saw this weekend. I do think they will be more than fine. That being said, there are reasons to worry if you're a Georgia fan. There are reasons to think that this team isn't quite to the level that you need it to be, and the O-line's probably the biggest reason, and the D-line's a great reason as well, but that's more injury-related. But the O-line, not having Tate Ratledge, likely for Bama and Texas, is going to be very tough. They're going to have to make sure that Michael Morris and Dylan Fairchild are playing really elite football, especially when they walk into Bama in a couple of weeks. They need that group very, very badly, and if they can't get that group back to that level that the elite level they need to be playing at, it could be 3 losses on this schedule. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy looking at this schedule going into the season and with UGA being the team that they are. And frankly, I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, but if the O-line can't get figured out, then a lot of things could happen that I didn't envision for this Georgia team. So it's definitely something to watch. Tate Ratledge being on the sideline, maybe the most valuable player on this offense. I'll take Carson back out of it, but a very valuable player nonetheless, and someone that you very much need on the field as quickly as possible if you're Georgia. Ohio State I have at number 2. They were kind of just hanging out this past weekend, so it's not necessarily about Ohio State, more about Georgia's struggles in this one. But Ohio State did exactly what they've needed to do this entire year. They've executed at a very high level, started like 5 minutes, started really slow against Akron, then picked it up and did really, really well. Their EPA per play on both sides of the ball is downright elite, one of the best in the country. They're doing exactly what they need to be doing. Now, they don't necessarily get tested for quite some time. They have Marshall this upcoming weekend, and then I believe their Big Ten schedule starts with a couple of layups. I'll be totally honest with you. But at the end of the day, we will be able to see this team on the grand stage when they go over to Eugene to play Oregon, and we'll see what they're made of then. But as of right now, I have no reason to move them from one of these top spots. And then finally, Texas did enough this weekend. I think they did enough to possibly take over that number 1 spot. Georgia struggled just a little bit. Texas has not taken their foot off the gas for a second this season. They've been on absolute go the entire time now. The Ewers injury is a worry. There's no two ways about that. But if he's going to be back for that Mississippi State game, which it looks like he will be, then I have no reason to worry about them. I think ULM is probably one of the worst teams in the FBS, and Arch Manning looks to be not near the worst quarterback in the FBS. So I think they're going to be more than fine in that game. They do need to get Ewers back before that OU game at the very least, because that'll be a key for the rest of the season. If they can't get that, then it's going to be interesting to see how this team develops throughout the rest of the year. But as of right now, cannot find a better team in the country than the Texas Longhorns. I think they're playing really clean football, and especially what I thought coming into the season, they're executing that and then some. Really, really impressive stuff from Steve Sarkisian, and they seem to be just rolling along in Austin, Texas. But really, really tough list to put together. I think from this past weekend, those 4 through 7 teams, Ole Miss, Miami, Tennessee, and Alabama, rank them however you want. I think you could order them a number of different ways. I think you could have Georgia still your number 1 team, and I would not fault you too much. I understand that they have these games pretty much every year, and faulting them too much, I wouldn't necessarily be against you on that one. You could have Texas at number 3 or 4. I think there's a number of teams that have played really clean. Point is, it's very hard to put these groups together. I think you can rank them however you like. I think there's a number of different ways to go about it, but that's the 12 that I have. I do think Texas is the best team in the country. I still think Ohio State, Texas, and Georgia are standing a little bit above everyone else, but that gap is thinning just a little bit as time goes on. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. If you're not just a college football person like myself, if you loved what you saw from the Atlanta Falcons yesterday, you're more than welcome to go check out all of the NFL podcasts, all of the sports podcasts. We have a wrestling podcast. I believe we're going to have a tennis podcast here pretty soon, but you might have to wait just a little bit on that one. We have just about everything you need in the world of sports, so come on over and check out all the stuff we have. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow for some Week 4 previews.
Mm-hmm.